I'm gonna run to the city of refuge. I'm gonna run to the city of refuge. I'm gonna run to the city of refuge.
Hello and welcome to Christian Perspectives. I'm Bob O'Halloran, and of course to help us explore some of those questions that we've always wanted to ask, Pastor Tom Countryman of Portage United Methodist Church. Pastor Tom, this day and age, we read the statistics, 1 out of every 2 marriages ends in divorce and so on. What's the biblical perspective on divorce? Are we allowed to divorce?
So the text, Jesus talking about the subject that he did. He says, he was asked a question. Well, Moses said we could divorce. In the law, in the Bible, in the law, it says you can divorce. You just have to write out a certificate of divorce. And so they asked Jesus about this. What do you think? And his answer is, he says, Moses wrote this because of the hardness of your hearts. But when God created us, God's intention was that a man shall leave his father and mother. It's Jesus quotes from Genesis chapter 2. A man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And then Jesus adds these words. This is his commentary on the Genesis text. Therefore they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let no one separate. So Jesus is very clear, and he goes on to explain this, that you shouldn't divorce, that and that you can't just divorce and then go remarry somebody. He actually goes into the description in the Gospels where he basically says if you divorce and then get remarried, you're committing adultery. Now this is really hard because we live in a world where 1 out of 2 marriages end in failure because of the hardness of our hearts. And so, what I want to start, I want to be clear. God, I mean, this is how it actually says it in the Old Testament. I hate divorce, saith the Lord. Divorce, in its cultural context, had a lot of real problems. It was really difficult for women. They had no financial resources. So for a woman, and a woman didn't have the power to initiate a divorce, only the man did. So in many ways, divorce was particularly cruel for women. And so a prohibition against divorce is very helpful for women. It protects women economically in that culture. But Jesus still isn't talking about economics. Some people have made the observation that that's true, that the effect of Jesus' teaching is to protect women. But he's not talking about that. He's talking about a spiritual concept, the idea that marriage is intended to be a union of 2 lives together in a covenant that's not intended to be broken. And we actually make the promise till death do us part. That's in the promise. So when we make a covenant, we're not supposed to break it. And yet, and here's the part where for me this is the struggle. Now, not for me personally in the sense that I've been married for 35 and a half years and intend to see that through to the end without any problem. But I think about my own parents. My parents divorced when I was very, very young. And my dad remarried, and he and my stepmom lived together. They were together for over 50 years, and up until the time my dad died. And so I look at that. I look at my parents, at my mom and my dad, and I'm really glad they were married long enough to have me. But I also look at that and I think I can't imagine them ever being married. But I look at my dad and my stepmom, and I think that really worked. And so, on the one hand, I've got Jesus being very clear about saying divorce is wrong. We don't get divorced. And then there's the experience of my father where I see him doing well. I had a friend, a member of a church that I served some years ago. He was on his 3rd marriage. First one, he told me that they were just way too young. The second one, he had 2 great kids in that marriage, but his wife he described her as crazy, and I met her and she was. But the 3rd one, great marriage. Just a really good couple, and a really interesting mix because they weren't identical. I mean, he was very conservative and she was very liberal. He was a Republican, she was a Democrat. But it was they were really great together. And I looked at that, and they've been together for, I don't know, 20, 30 years now. And I think, wow, I'm really glad that they got married. So the question then for me personally becomes, should we take what Jesus is teaching us as law that we're now subject to, just as the law of Moses was a law that people who were under the law were subject to? Or do we recognize the possibility of grace in there? Now, Paul takes a little softer view of marriage than Jesus seems to. Paul actually says things like, if a believer is married to an unbeliever and the unbeliever wants a divorce, then the believer is free to divorce them. But if the unbeliever wants to remain married, then the believer ought to stay married to them, just because they bring grace into that relationship, and maybe the unbelieving spouse will become a believer as a result. And Paul makes the point that we're called to freedom in that. But you know what? I'm for marriage, and my experience has been, if you hang in there, you'll be glad. If you hang in there and you work through the hard times, you'll be glad you did.
And that, of course, is Christian Perspectives for this time around. We want to thank Pastor Tom Countryman, and for him, I'm Bob O'Halloran. Remember, God loves you, and so do we.
I'm gonna run.